The first couple of years of the Weimar Republic's existence were everything but peaceful. They were marked by violence, uncertainty, and bitterness. Born from Germany's defeat in the First World War, the young democracy had a hard time finding the approval of its citizens, and its legitimacy was openly questioned from the very beginning. Of course, you had the open opposition from the socialists and the communists, who wanted to establish a council republic instead, in which the working people held all the power. Several attempts to achieve such a form of government were usually violently put down by the government with the help of the Reichswehr or paramilitary Freikorps units. The most famous example of this are the suppression of the Bavarian Socialist Republic in April 1919, or the crackdown on the Spartacist uprising in January 1919 with the subsequent murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. As such, the pro-Republican Weimar coalition, consisting of the Social Democratic Party, the Centre Party and the German Democratic Party, which governed the country until 1920, was almost constantly exposed to hostilities. By 1920, however, the parties on the extreme left, including the Communist Party and the Independent Social Democratic Party, no longer posed an immediate threat to the young republic. Instead, for the time being, they seemed to be quite content to focus on inter-party arguments about the best revolutionary strategy and on accusing each other of not being true leftists. In the meantime, the extreme right was much more effective at rallying people for its cause. It denounced the Weimar Republic as a shameful abomination, a Jewish republic that was imposed onto the German people against their will by the Entente powers. It also accused the politicians who ended the war and those who agreed to sign the Treaty of Versailles as traitors to the national cause. Tens of thousands of people flocked to anti-Semitic and racial organizations, such as the Deutschvölkischer, Schutz and Trutz-Bundes. This organization was one of the main advocates for the stab-in-the-back myth, which claims that the German army was never actually defeated on the field, but was instead betrayed by either the socialists or the Jews. It also denied the legitimacy of the Weimar Republic, and claimed that democracy was the real precursor to the political domination and economic conquest of the German people by Judaism. A notable target group of far-right agitation was the Reichswehr, the German military, where anti-republican sentiment was widespread. In February 1920, for example, the minister for the Reichswehr, Gustav Noske, had to intervene against a general who had allowed the spreading of a flyer by the Schutz und Trutz-Bund, which called for violent insurrection against anti-national and anti-German forces, so the Republican government. Several commanders and officers refused to take an oath on the black-red-gold flag of the Republic and instead demanded the right to keep wearing the black-white-red cockade. It's fair to say that it was extremely difficult for pro-Republican positions to establish themselves in the military. After the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, Paul von Hindenburg and Wilhelm Gröner surrendered their high command over the army. President Friedrich Ebert then appointed the Social Democratic politician Gustav Noske as Minister for the Reichswehr. Army command was then granted to Colonel Walter Reinhardt, while Major General Hans von Seeckt was made the commander-in-chief. From the get-go, tensions rose between Reinhardt and Seeckt. While Reinhardt wished to transform the army into a loyal instrument of the young republic, Seeckt instead wished to regain the army's former glory. To that end, Seeckt fought against all democratic elements within the army. Some Social Democratic officers have reported that pro-Republican officers were systematically removed from their posts. One young officer, for example, said that Noske had achieved great things, but that he was surrounded by people who sabotaged his work under his hands. This development was further exacerbated by the fact that hundreds of thousands of former soldiers who had fought in World War I had organized themselves in paramilitary groups, the so-called Freikorps. By 1920, most of the Reichswehr also consisted of former Freikorps units. The problem was that most Freikorps soldiers held anti-republican views and saw no issue in employing violence to achieve their goals. The Freikorps protected the government in Berlin and Weimar out of a sense of duty, brutally suppressed left-leaning insurrections, and fought against Polish troops in Upper Silesia, Greater Poland and West Prussia. Some of them even fought in the Baltic states amid the Latvian War for Independence and the Russian Civil War. After World War I, many Freikorps fighters were frustrated. They knew nothing but war. Many of them had gone to war straight after leaving school. They never had an actual job, were shaped by years of brutality and violence, and struggled to find a place in the new German society. Many of them held deep hatred against the Weimar Republic, felt betrayed by the sudden end of the war, and sought justice. Their livelihoods seemed to be in danger when the terms of the Treaty of Versailles became known to the public. In 1919, around 660,000 men were under arms, of whom around 400,000 were in the Reichswehr. According to the treaty, Germany was only allowed to field 100,000 men, and it had time until the spring of 1920 to disarm the rest and to disband the Freikorps units. If that plan went through, hundreds of thousands of people would suddenly be without purpose and on the streets. And so they began to hatch a plot. Many dismissed Freikorps fighters found employment on large farms in rural Pomerania, East Prussia and Brandenburg, where they got in contact with resentful officers, large landowners and nationalist politicians. While they might have had different reasons, they all agreed on the common goal. The Republic has to go. If someone wanted to violently overthrow the government, these disgruntled Freikorps men were going to be the perfect asset for it. And a full-fledged conspiracy had been brewing indeed. In 1919, the right-wing, anti-republican organization with the name National Union had been founded in Berlin. Some of the officers in the National Union were only there to fend off a possible left-wing insurrection in the future, but the heads of the organization clearly wanted to plan a coup, and to replace the current government with a temporary dictatorship. Let's quickly take a look at the most important conspirators. First, there was Erich Ludendorff, the famous general who had been the de facto head of the army and quasi-dictator of Germany in the last years of World War I. After the war had ended, Ludendorff fled to Sweden and only returned to Germany in 1919. To deflect the responsibility for the German defeat away from him, he spread the stab-in-the-back myth and instead blamed the civilian population. Then there was Wolfgang Kapp, a talented civil servant from East Prussia. He was a member of the far-right and anti-Semitic German National People's Party and led the party's East Prussian branch. He deeply disliked the democratic rule of government, as he considered it to be a form of decomposition of the German state due to the never-ending bickering between the parties. He preferred a united national government that would serve the interests of the German state the best, at least in his eyes. Kapp believed that the Weimar government's willingness to accept the Allied terms of German disarmament would eliminate the last possible means to stage a successful counter-revolution by the army. He wanted to strike as soon as possible. And while he didn't want to establish his dictatorship with violent means, he still demonstrated that he had no problem with sacrificing thousands of lives for his cause. But even if our action were unsuccessful and the hundreds of thousands who joined us were led to death and destruction, German honor would at least be safe for the benefit of future political development opportunities. The lives of even hundreds of thousands are out of the question when it comes to the inglorious downfall of the entire German nation. Next up was Walter von Lüttwitz, a renowned and powerful general who commanded over all the troops east of the river Elbe. Since the end of the war, he had supported the establishment of the Freikorps units and had personally led them in most military repressions against left-wing uprisings. He was convinced that Germany headed towards its downfall and that the military needed to intervene. He sought to find allies within the Reichswehr who would support his goals, but this turned out to be much harder than he thought. While most officers agreed that the reduction of the army to 100,000 soldiers would be disastrous and that a socialist government should be prevented, they still did not want a direct army intervention. Even within his group command, Lüttwitz struggled to find determined allies. General Georg Merker, for instance, stated that the Reichswehr should keep out of internal politics altogether and that it wasn't its job to depose and instate new governments. Most officers preferred to work together with President Ebert and Gustav Noske, who they considered to be the lesser evil compared to a potential socialist government, and to only apply some pressure when necessary. General Roderich von Schöler, for instance, who commanded all troops in West and South Germany, refused to make any concrete statement. The final two prominent members of the conspiracy were Waldemar Pabst, a captain who had played a key role in the crushing of the Spartakist uprising in 1919, as well as the murders of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and Colonel Max Bauer, a personal advisor to Erich Ludendorff. But what were the actual plans of the conspiracy? Wolfgang Kapp, the de facto leader, made his ideas very clear in a letter to Axel von Freytag-Loringhofen, an anti-Semitic and nationalist professor at the University of Breslau. Removal of the government, dissolution of the National Assembly, a conservative minister cabinet under the chancellorship of Kapp, new elections for a constituent Reichstag, and the renunciation of the Versailles Treaty. Kapp felt that time was running against him as the Weimar Constitution had already come into effect and as the German government prepared to implement the disarmament clauses of the Versailles Treaty. But even within the conspiracy, there were disagreements. General von Lüttwitz didn't want to violently change the constitution, for example, but only wanted to depose the government and call for new elections. He wasn't as optimistic about their plans as Kapp was, as he knew about the ambivalent sentiment within the Reichswehr. Lüttwitz also wanted to cooperate with leading social democratic politicians to achieve his goals, while Kapp only wanted to establish a dictatorship that should suppress the Social Democrats. These differences in opinion led to the conspiracy being incredibly poorly planned and badly organized. The conspirators were overly confident in their abilities to restructure the country and never truly considered the consequences of such a violent coup. They never attempted to appeal to the masses or to even consider the mood of the German public. That is the main reason for why the Kapp-Lüttwitz Putsch, which is the term that most historians use to describe their coup attempt in March 1920, proved to be such a debacle. The time to strike came in March 1920. When the Treaty of Versailles came into effect in January of the same year, resentment against the Weimar Republic grew massively within the Freikorps units. On top of the reduction of the army to just 100,000 men, the Allies also demanded the dissolution of the Freikorps, including the Marinebrigade Erger, a large Freikorps brigade mainly consisting of former members of the German Navy. In February, Gustav Noske gave the order to dissolve the Marinebrigade. And so, on the 10th of March 1920, General von Lüttwitz met with Friedrich Ebert and Gustav Noske to present his demands. He insisted on the dissolution of the National Assembly, new elections, the appointment of new ministers, the deposition of the pro-republican general Walter Reinhardt in favor of Lüttwitz, and the withdrawal of the order to dissolve the Marinebrigade. Ebert and Noske obviously denied these demands, but they made a crucial mistake. Instead of simply having Lüttwitz arrested for treason, which is what they should have done, they instead just suspended him and advised him to resign from his post. This allowed Lüttwitz to drive to Döberitz, where the Marinebrigade was stationed, and to discuss his plans with its leader, Hermann Erhard. Noske was informed too late about Lüttwitz's conspiracy. From the Reichswehr he had only received trivializing reports, and General Hans von Seeckt only informed him when it was too late. On the 13th of March, Noske was faced with the consequences of his negligent approach to handling the brewing conspiracy. The Marinebrigade Erhard was marching on Berlin. In a hastily organized emergency meeting at night, Noske met with the leading heads of the Reichswehr. He argued that a violent insurrection can only be stopped with violence, but all of the present generals except for the head of army command, Walter Reinhardt, disagreed. Instead, Hans von Seeckt claimed that fighting back against the rebels would be pointless and that it would only lead to unnecessary bloodshed. Despite the fact that the march on Berlin by Lüttwitz and Erhard was a crystal clear case of treason of the highest order and the biggest threat the Republic had ever faced so far, the Reichswehr simply stayed neutral and gave up the country's largest city without any sort of resistance. With no way to stop the coup, the government met at 4 AM to discuss their next steps. The ministers agreed that it would be too dangerous for all of them to stay in Berlin, as they could be extorted or even killed by the rebels. Further, a successful counterattack could only be organized outside of the capital. And so, most ministers, including President Ebert and Chancellor Gustav Bauer, fled to Dresden, while a couple of them remained in Berlin to negotiate with the rebels and to prevent a complete loss of authority. After marching into Berlin, Lüttwitz once again presented the same demands from 3 days ago, and once again the government declined. Lüttwitz suddenly found himself in a tricky spot. He had initially hoped to pressure the government into negotiations, but now that it had fled and denied any sort of cooperation, he had no choice but to create his own government. He may never have wanted to do it, but now he had no choice but to appoint Wolfgang Kapp as the new chancellor and to task him with forming a new provisional cabinet. After occupying the Reich Chancellery, Kapp immediately set his long-hatched plan in motion to eliminate parliamentary democracy. He proclaimed the dissolution of the National Assembly and proclaimed martial law, forbade all public meetings and newspapers, and made his goal of establishing an authoritarian state in which the revolutionary constitution imposed on the German people was replaced by a new corporatist constitution, abundantly clear. The return of a parliamentary predominance by the Social Democrats in the future should be prevented at all costs. In the early morning hours of the 13th of March, the Social Democratic Party proclaimed a countrywide general strike. Workers, party comrades, the military coup is here. The Baltic mercenaries, fearing the ordered dissolution, have attempted to abolish the Republic and form a dictatorial government, with Lüttwitz and Kapp at the helm. The labour of an entire year is to be smashed into ruins, your hard-won freedom destroyed. Everything is at stake. That is why the fiercest means of defence are called for. No business may run as long as the military dictatorship of the Ludendorffs prevail. Therefore, lay down your work. Go on strike. Cut off the air from this reactionary clique. Fight with every centre for the preservation of the Republic. Leave all strife aside. There is only one remedy against the dictatorship of Wilhelm II. Paralyze all economic life. Not one finger must be raised. No proletarian may help the military dictatorship. General strike across the board. Proletarians unite. Down with the counter-revolution. Even though the general strike was proclaimed in the name of all social democratic ministers, its exact origin story is not precisely known. It is most likely that it wasn't the government who came up with the idea, but Otto Wels, the party chairman, who realized that the party needed to employ drastic measures to prevent the counter-revolution. For far too long, the Social Democrats had been plagued by inner division, and many party members were upset about how the Social Democratic ministers dealt with threats to democracy. While left-wing opposition was usually crushed with force, right-wing anti-republicanism in the army and elsewhere was often tolerated and handled with a lot of patience. Now the party finally rallied the working people and employed its most powerful tool, the general strike, to cripple the rebels. The call for the general strike was very quickly answered by the General German Trade Union Federation under the leadership of Karl Legien. He wanted to create a united socialist front against the insurrectionists and called on the members of the union to lay down their tools. But the far-left parties initially refused to cooperate with the Social Democrats in the government. The Communist Party published a proclamation urging its members not to participate in the general strike yet. It, and by that it meant the revolutionary proletariat, will not lift a finger for the government of the murderers of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, which perished in disgrace and dishonor. It will not lift a finger for the Democratic Republic, which was only a poor mask for the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Only when thousands of communist workers all over Germany decided to partake in the general strike anyway, did the Communist Party change its mind and proclaim its solidarity with the striking workers. The general strike proved to be extremely effective. After just one day, the entire German economy had been completely paralyzed, and the rebels had been deprived of all their power. In some areas, the workers even took up arms and successfully fought against the reactionaries who tried to march into their areas. Examples for this were recorded in Silesia, Kiel, Halle, Frankfurt, and most famously in the Ruhr area. With the support of the left-wing parties, a paramilitary workers' defense force, soon called the Red Army, fought back against the Freikorps. After just 1 week of fighting, the whole Ruhr area, including its industry, was under their control. It can be said that, in general, only a tiny fraction of the German population supported the Kapp-Lüttwitz Putsch. Generally, most supporters were large landowners, officers and civil servants from Germany's rural east, and not even they stood unconditionally behind the rebels. The army, while not exactly harbouring sympathetic feelings towards the Republic, still saw the strong resistance within the working class, and came to the conclusion that a right-wing coup would only lead to further polarisation of German society. Even big business owners and capitalists, such as Hugo Stinnes, one of the biggest industrialists of the time, who had financially supported the conspiratory National Union, renounced their support out of fear for economic disruptions. But not just the workers, but also many members of the educated middle class in liberal Baden and Württemberg rejected the coup because it felt too Prussian to them. Kapp and Lüttwitz could proclaim whatever they wanted, and their Freikorps thugs could terrorize Berlin as much as they wished. If the workers refused to work and the civil servants in Berlin didn't follow their orders, their desired authoritarian state was never going to work. Already on the 15th of March, just 2 days after the march on Berlin, Kapp already announced that he was willing to reach a compromise with the legitimate government. But the ministers under Chancellor Bauer didn't see the need to negotiate. They knew that the coup had failed disastrously. On the 17th of March, both Kapp and Lüttwitz resigned and fled abroad. Kapp to Sweden and Lüttwitz to Hungary. When the Marinebrigade Erger marched past the Brandenburg Gate on their way out of the city, they were met with an angry crowd who loudly protested. The Freikorps men retaliated by opening fire, as a result of which 12 people lost their lives and 30 more got wounded. But the general strike was not over yet. Legien and the trade unions approached the government and presented a list of 9 points that should be fulfilled. Legien wanted to make sure that the status quo before the putsch wouldn't come back. It included some demands that seem obvious, such as the punishment of all those involved in the coup, the democratization of the administration, the dissolution of all counter-revolutionary elements within the army, and it also pressured the government to finally pursue its promised policies in regards to social security and extortionate prices on the market. But it also included one point that would have given the trade unions a much bigger say in legislation and in appointing the ministers in the cabinet. That last demand would have turned the Weimar Republic into a trade union state, which would have violated the constitution. As you can imagine, neither the Social Democrats, nor the Centre Party, or the German Democratic Party were willing to accept these points. There is evidence to suggest that Legien knew that many of his demands would never be realistically accepted, but instead hoped that they would increase the solidarity between the workers and lessen the internal opposition in the trade unions. Still, the trade unions had some success. On the 20th of March, the unpopular minister Gustav Noske resigned, and the government also agreed to socialize the industries that were ready for it. After the chancellor also agreed to enter talks with the other governing parties to create a workers' government and to not attack the armed workers in the Ruhr area, the general strike finally ended. On the 27th of March, the new government was sworn in. Gustav Bauer was replaced by another Social Democrat, Hermann Müller, who became the new Chancellor of Germany. But in general, the desired workers' cabinet didn't come about. The new minister for the Reichswehr was a man named Otto Gessler, who belonged to the right wing of the German Democratic Party and who explained that the Republic was not a matter close to his heart. The fact that the Social Democrats no longer insisted on a minister for the Reichswehr from their ranks was nothing but a retreat from political responsibility and would set a bad precedent for future developments. This was one of the party's biggest mistakes. While Noske was hated by many on the left for his failure to prevent the putsch and his role in crushing the Spartacist uprising in 1919, he still worked hard on firmly integrating the Reichswehr. Now that the Social Democrats simply abandoned the post of Minister for the Reichswehr and left it to Otto Gessler, there was no chance that the army was ever going to become fully tamed and a reliable instrument of the Republic. And finally, let's discuss what the consequences of the Kapp-Putsch were. First off, none of the main conspirators were punished. Ludendorff was simply never prosecuted and would partake in another attempted coup just 3 years later. Kapp returned to Germany in 1922, where he was arrested. Just a few months later, he died from cancer. Lüttwitz also returned to Germany in 1921 and faced no legal consequences. He even managed to receive a pension from the Prussian state. The only leaders of the putsch who were brought before court were Georg Wilhelm Schiele, who was supposed to be Kapp's Minister for the Economy, Konrad von Wangenheim, the designated Minister for Agriculture, and Traugott von Jagow, the former police president of Berlin and wannabe Interior Minister. Only Jagow was punished and sentenced to 5 years in prison for committing high treason. His sentence was so low because the court saw his selfless love for the fatherland as a mitigating factor. In 1925, the new president Paul von Hindenburg granted an amnesty to everyone who partook in the putsch. After the end of the Kapp-Lüttwitz-Putsch, the Reichswehr should have been reformed and further integrated into the state apparatus. It had failed to protect the state and its reputation had hit rock bottom. The army should finally have been transformed into a reliable, pro-republican force. But that didn't happen. Instead, after being faced with aversion from his officers, the democratic head of Army Command, Walter Reinhardt, resigned. He was replaced by his old rival Hans von Seeckt. Seeckt immediately went to work. He strengthened his own position, fired pro-republican officers who had refused direct orders during the coup attempt, and gradually transformed the army into a highly autonomous institution which was only loyal to the Weimar Constitution on paper. Ironically, it was thanks to the Kapp-Putsch that the Reichswehr emerged in a stronger position than before. The government still depended on the armed forces to crush the left-wing insurrection in the Ruhr area. Initially, the state commissioner for the Ruhr area, Karl Severing, had reached an agreement with the leaders of the insurrection. In exchange for giving up their arms, they were promised that the Reichswehr was not going to march in. However, those leaders had lost control over the more radical elements of the Red Army, as a result of which the uprising continued. In April, the Reichswehr did march in, accompanied by Freikorps units, and committed countless heinous atrocities. Arbitrary arrests, mistreatment of captives, violence against the local population, and executions of arrested workers without a proper trial, just to name a few. The events of the year 1920 further polarized German society. While the crushing of the Kapp-Lüttwitz Putsch may initially seem like a massive victory for the governing parties and the Weimar Republic as a whole, it only further weakened them. In the early parliamentary elections of June 1920, the parties of the Weimar coalition suffered their biggest defeat yet. The Social Democrats lost 16.3% of the votes, and the German Democratic Party lost 10.1%. The big winners were far-left parties, the National Liberal German People's Party and the far-right nationalist German National People's Party, and neither of those could seriously be considered democratic. Many voters on the left were upset about how the moderate parties had handled the reactionary uprising, and how violently they had crushed the Ruhr uprising in comparison, while voters on the right feared a strengthening of the working class movement after seeing the success of the general strike. The Weimar coalition lost its majority in the Reichstag, and it would never recover from this loss of votes. But the enemies of the Republic also didn't achieve a full majority. As a consequence of this, Germany saw 7 different coalitions in just 4 years, which made the country very difficult to govern and is one of the main reasons for why the Weimar Republic remained so unstable until 1924. The parties learned from the fateful spring of 1920 and came to the conclusion that the voting base always punished the ruling parties for their current problems, even if they weren't necessarily responsible for them. To prevent this, each party was mostly concerned with keeping their voting base, and compromises were more difficult to achieve than ever before. Alright, dankeschön to you for watching the video. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little summary of the Kapp-Lüttwitz Putsch, which turned out to be much longer than I initially expected it to be. If you did, please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and leaving a like while you're at it. As always, a special and massive thank you goes out to my invaluable supporters over on Ko-Fi. A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Philipp Marchewka, Marius Gerling, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wienweh, Süderreiser, Lyle Furphy, Yin, and William. You are nothing short of phenomenal. Have a very wonderful day, and see you next time.